Welcome to Kodachi for Three, a bi-weekly podcast where three friends and passionate players discuss the world of Wraith. If you're looking for flesh and blood content, we've got it. Focusing on competitive play, community building, and yes, going off on plenty of tangents. From our favorite casual builds to the market, nothing is off limits. So sit back, relax, and prepare yourself for Kodachi for Three.
Welcome to Kodachi for Three. We are your hosts. I'm Adam Roach.
I'm Drayton Gans.
And I am not being filled with a room of resin fumes. I had to turn off the ventilation system to record, so we'll see if my printer takes me out by the end of this one.
And now you can watch this on video in addition to podcast. So if you didn't know, Shay got a new 3D printer, and he may pass out during this. So watch it live.
Yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, the poorly constructed box held together with duct tape is where I built my fume hood.
Yeah, this can't be safe. It's probably going to affect our tangents.
What is happening?
So we're gonna jump into the featured card for this evening and not get off the rails in the first 10 minutes. All right, so our featured card, we're gonna kind of keep with the new is always better situation here. We're gonna talk about Islander. I think Islander's a great looking hero, elemental wizard, young hero of course, but this is an ice wizard, essence of ice on the card. If it's not your turn, you can play a non-attack action card with a blue color strip from your arsenal as though they were instants. Whenever you play an ice card during an opponent's turn, she creates frostbite tokens under their control. So I think it's interesting, but let's dive in general discussion. What do we think about it, guys?
Pretty card.
So, if this is what we're going to be seeing from Everfest as far as kind of like a cycle of heroes for some of these other classes that tie them in with the elemental, where they're kind of a young hero that's mono element and stuff. I'm really excited to see how that kind of turns out. I think for Blitz, this is an interesting character. If you're playing Wizard, this is an interesting twist on Wizard. And depending on what we see in the form of more generic Wizard and Ice cards in Everfest, this could be a really interesting, if not solid, maybe competitive, Blitz thing. So I'm pretty hyped. And it's not because I hope I get a lightning ninja.
Honestly,
I mean, you can tell us that that's what you're actually hoping for, Shay. If no one will judge.
No,
you.
I want a bard. We've been over this.
Okay.
I know I think he's afraid to ask for a bard at this point.
Yeah.
I legitimately think this is likely to be competitive, at least in a Blitz scenario. I mean, Kano requires a 3-cost pitch just to look at the top card of the deck, and then they can play it as though it were an instant. Granted, blues are less impactful cards that you're getting to play instantly here, and it has some conditions to it, right? It's got to be in your arsenal. There's a lot you can add to this. It also allows you not necessarily to have such a heavy blue cost curve in your deck. Your blues can always be used as instants, and you can run cheaper, kind of that muscle Kano type style out of it. It also has almost the full boat of health at 18 health instead of 15 for Kano, so...
Right.
Which is,
I think the health distinction tells us this is probably going to play a little more control variant than Kano. And important distinction versus Kano, she can say goodbye to your Null Rune by using Expose the Elements to blow up Null Rune.
Yeah.
Which is a scary thought when facing down a wizard.
She's not going to have the explosive combos that Kano has, but I think she's going to be able to really dictates the pace of play to a degree, and is going to be able to be less kind of monolithic. When you came up against Kano, you kind of knew what you were getting with Kano. Muscle Kano being the kind of weird outlier with that.
Sure.
So.
Aberration that was never terribly competitive, so I don't want to speak about it as if it was, of course.
Right. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how she gets fleshed out. As I've mentioned before, I'm most excited for these heroes for Pit Fight and trying out that format. But as we all know, I'm not a big Blitz guy, so I'm excited to try them out in other formats.
Yeah, that's fair. I know me and Shay are a little bit more Blitz fans than you are, and I think this can be competitive in Blitz, but overall, I know that's not necessarily the most competitive format in the world, so. I'm still
In
looking
meme
forward to
tier
it.
though, she's got a lot of meme potential, which also makes me happy. There's some real meme decks you could build.
That's very true. So I'm trying to think of cards that would be very good for her. I'm typically thinking of things just like pinging somebody out with a Scalding Rain. So blue costs 1, 2 arcane damage. Never bad to include in your deck. They block for 3. That kind of a situation. But there's a lot you can do with this.
Polar, like Polar Blast? You could do a
I'm
blue
not
Polar
big on
Blast.
Polar Blast. I mean, yes, it does draw a card, but it costs to play it. I think that Winter's Bite and Channel Like Frigil are going to be your big 2 ice cards that are going to both give a Frostbite and disrupt their turn. I think potions, even strength potions, could be huge of her. Just like flipping them out on your opponent's turn, so that way they're not costing you an action on your turn. Setting up so those big turns, I think that could be huge. And then, like I said, expose the elements. I mean, being able to blow up your opponent's null runes so they can't block your arcane damage could be devastating. I mean, that's just something that Kano can't do that she can. So that's.
And if she can get that ice saturation and blitz to where she's stalling, 1 or 2 frostbites here or there when you're on like a tight curve, like, 1 or 2 cards here and there, it adds up, man.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Amulet of Ice could be interesting here. I don't know how much fusion.
Ooh, I hadn't thought about Amulet of Ice, but yes.
The Amulet of Ice was my ice card that I wanted to get out there as an instant, plopping it down on the board, having them be able to discard a card or pay 2. That seems like that could end up being a big deal. Needing to have a fuse trigger is really the issue there.
Yeah, she would only have the one with the weave, or not weave. What is it? The attack that decides that dominates.
Entwine.
Entwine ice. Yes.
Yeah,
that'd
so
really be
just
her only source, but
not the real making as much.
I mean, the other question is, I don't think we're probably going to see an elemental wizard card. I think we're going to see ice cards and we'll see wizard cards. So it will be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what an elemental hero that is not utilizing the fuse mechanic as much, if that in itself is a form of like liberation, as far as like options, or if you're kind of even more hamstrung if you don't have access to that. So
it's hard to say. Right now, the way I picture it, I honestly expect that this particular hero will use, even though it has Essence of Ice, I assume it's actually not going to use a whole lot of ice cards unless we get more ice cards in this set that synergize. I just don't really see including a ton of them there. That Frostbite token is great in certain situations, but it's not enough to build a deck around here. I think you're still trying to trigger the blue out of Arsenal more than anything else.
It's definitely fair for... No, I think that's definitely fair for the ice cards we've seen so far. Presumably at some point we will revisit Arya in a set, like as another core set, and who knows what we'll see in that case. So we might see like a different ice wizard who is like maybe ice lightning or something like that, and they do crazy weird things. And then the support for her just goes out the window, right? So
yeah, elemental D react though.
I'm mostly excited just to be seeing that this is kind of the direction of how they're going to make future wizards without making them too much like Kano. Like, I like this idea of like, okay, it's kind of like an arrow in Arsenal, but it requires a little more conditions in order to do so, right? Your opponent doesn't know what you're putting in your arsenal, but it could be a blue, and then therefore you could play it, right? I like this idea of like, it doesn't feel oppressive, but also it still feels like you want Wizard to feel, if that makes sense.
You still get your instant zapping somebody on their
turn
kind of situation, which is a very cool line of play.
Right.
And I know it's something a lot of people who play Wizard enjoy, right? Finding those perfect trigger points, those perfect opportunities. So
yeah, the key design to a wizard is it's not your turn, it's our turn.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so keeping that feel is important. I kind of like you said, I like that we're seeing these young heroes out of Crucible, out of this new set, just because they're evergreen to an extent. They're not rotating in the same way, or it's at least very unlikely. We're not really seeing a whole lot of heavy competitive blitz, and so they really are going to have a lot of build for long term, and it makes for great variety for casual players.
Right.
I'm also curious if the PvE format that they've teased is going to be Young Heroes only.
We will see. I don't want to jump down that rabbit hole till we know more on that. But I do want to
This
say,
is
um,
speculation.
I do want to say that I like because if people talk about like are we gonna see an adult version of her and things like that. I think she might possibly. There's been other rumblings of some things that make me think that maybe this might be less of the case, but I think possibly she might be our Shiana of the set because she does have a majestic rating for rarity. So rather than being a regular token hero, she might be our rare hero, quote unquote, for the set. Um,
Oh, see, I think she's gonna kind of. I think we're gonna get a majestic kind of cycle of some young heroes in this set.
I
Yeah,
hope not, but
it's hard for me. The last heroes were all rares, right? So Crucibles, Parallels, those heroes were rares or legendary. And so this time we're seeing Majestics. So it's hard for me to say how I think that's gonna go. I kind
I
of expect all the young heroes to be primarily Majestic or Token.
Mm-hmm.
you mean rare token or?
No, I think they're gonna live in majestic.
I really hope not, personally, just because it's gonna feel really awful if you crack a whole box of crew and all your majestics are just heroes that you're not gonna play if you don't play Blitz.
Yeah. I agree with you that I hope that's not the case, but I think it's pretty likely.
The other reason why I don't think they would fit in that majestic fold, is it adds an extra awkwardness to like we're getting these cold foils of them, as part of these kits, which already
Yeah.
was kind of weird for her, but we'll see. Um, my personal hope is that that's not what we're seeing, but
Yeah, it's so awkward with the rarities. Okay, well
Uh,
sorry, Shay, you got something else on this one before we dump out of the featured card?
Carnival slot, maybe? There are majestics that pop up in the carnival slot is something we maybe think, but I don't
that
know.
could be.
It could be for sure. I'm very interested in the carnival slot still overall. I feel like I haven't seen enough to speculate too wildly on the carnival spot, or to do anything but speculate wildly. So I don't necessarily want to do that here, but carnival slot's gonna be crazy.
Should be a good time.
All right, so let's go ahead and move into our main topic for today. So our main topic for today is going to kind of focus on how to identify your role in a match of Flesh and Blood. And so this is going to be based on the context of the article Who's the Beatdown. This is a very classic Magic the Gathering article. I think it came out 10 plus years ago. And I will make sure to link it in both the podcast link show notes as well as the YouTube show notes so everybody can read that as well. But I'm going to kind of turn it over to Drayton to kind of explain what does it mean to be on or off the beatdown and kind of what we're necessarily talking about when we talk about it in the context of Flesh and Blood, because it does require us to port it over.
Yeah, so being on the beatdown, if you're on the beatdown, you're the aggressor. You're the person who's playing the aggro tempo player. We talk about tempo a lot as a phrase that we throw around in competitive Flesh and Blood. And so if you're on the beatdown, you're the one controlling and holding the tempo most of the game. Okay? You're preferring to play your cards rather than blocking with them. On the other hand, if you read that article, you're going to hear them talk a lot about the control. Well, in classical Magic, control means a lot of different things rather than what we see in Flesh and Blood. But when we think about controlling a game, usually we're thinking about fatigue in Flesh and Blood. So I would typically refer to that more as fatigue rather than necessarily control. There's a control aspect to it. Don't get me wrong. But it's a little different than like when we think of control of Oldhim and Lexi with the ice cards than per se just like a Bravo control deck or a Dash control deck. We call those control decks, but really they're stalling out until they hit a certain state of the game.
They're inevitability, so I would call them combo decks, and I would consider it
right, but they're control adjacent in the fact that they're trying to maintain the status quo of like, okay, our life totals are high until they can change that, right? So usually in Flesh and Blood, the person who is controlling the tempo and being the aggressor at the time, that's who's on the beatdown, and that's who we're going to be referring to when we say that's the beatdown. If we're talking about the control, that's the person who's doing more of the blocking, looking for the little bits of chip damage, and more of responding, more directly responding to what their opponent is doing in the match. With that in mind, let's talk about how do you determine if you are on the beatdown or if you are the control player. Well, typically we're going to start by looking at how we're designing our deck to win. Obviously, if you are playing something like a Fatigue Oldhim, you don't want to be on the beat down. You're built your deck around, I'm going to stall at the game, create an inevitability, and then win that way, right? That inevitability might be you're out of deck, or it might have been I've swung my hammer for 4 enough times where you die if I hit you anymore. These things can happen. Another good example is, some Rhinar decks that are more control oriented. They want to hit that one big blood or spell a turn. That's all they're really looking for, right? On the other hand, your old Lightning Briars, your Aggro Katsus, your Chains, they want to be on the beatdown. They want to be constantly pushing pressure the whole time because that's what they're built to do, right? Um, Either of you have anything you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I have a couple things. I want to provide a little bit of context about why I feel like it's important to realize what your deck is supposed to do, right? Like, do you want to be the aggressor? Do you want to be the passive defender? That's going to be very important because it gives you a game plan. It influences all your decisions throughout a match. You never want to deviate from what your game plan is during a given match unless the situation has changed. So unless you have misidentified your opponent's role in a match. So that's really the only thing that I would add to the first to that. I agree with what you're saying about, what does it mean to be on or off the beat down? I think it's worth diving into more granular about, how we identify that, into a couple more subsets. But I'm going to let Shay add to some points here before we head down the road.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's an important thing to realize that your overall total is not what's dictating whether or not you have the beat down or not. You can be, ahead on life, and turns out you're the one that's being having your tempo burgled, and is a false sense of security you're in. Especially in things like aggro mirrors, there will be a thing where it's you've been letting more damage through. So no, I've been letting more damage through because now I've stolen back, the tempo and everything.
Yeah. I see this as a tiered identification, right? So for me, the first thing that everybody should do, they should identify if their deck intends to be the aggressor or the defender. So the person who is going to be active and proactive in the deck or reactive in the deck. That's just 100%. People should identify that as what their goal is when they build their deck. Then they should identify if there are specific matches in which that is not the case for them, or in which their opponent is also very reactive, but they're just better at it than they are, so then they must be the active player. And then the mirror match is the third, right? Because that's the hardest thing to identify. And so we'll kind of go through those things. But let's just start with some basic, how do we identify in a match? I think we've talked enough about how to identify if your own deck is in the beatdown, or do we want to talk about that more first?
We can talk about it a little bit more. And it's not going to necessarily be specific to what hero you're playing. We always talk about how Katsu, for example, has an aggro mid-range control. The mid-range being the most flexible, going between the modes of being on the beatdown versus being on the fatigue or control, right? Jumping between those two modes is going to be easiest for that deck. But it's got to determine where it is in the sideboarding decisions and pretty early on in the deck construction. So, what cards you're including in your deck is going to help determine that. Similar thing with Bravo. Are you including more Staunch Responses, or you're including more Zealous Beltings? These are cards that are going to help shape what your deck is trying to do in most of these situations, right? So, I think to have a game, don't necessarily say I have to play this game plan because I'm playing this hero, but have a game plan when building.
Mm-hmm. And know when you got to pivot, or change things up.
We'll talk about that in a bit more details because there is a time to have to do that, right? But you want to have a game plan and deck construction that's letting you decide, am I trying to win this way or that way?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a perfect example. Katsu is a great one for you. Rhinar is a great example as well. Romping Club Control is a real deck. Instead of your Mandible Claw aggro, but I can be very aggressive even with a Romping Club deck. So it's important to know those things and how I've built my cards to synergize there. If I want to be going hard, be going fast, I need to be making sure I'm including the cards for that. and sticking on that game plan and not just automatically going under the back foot because I'm feeling that way that game.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So in any given match, we then have to reassess this, right? So I know my deck wants to be the aggressor. That being said, I am Lightning Briar, and I'm matching up against Aggro Katsu. Or let's pick another deck that is more traditionally aggressive all the time, Lightning Lexi. And we're aware of those things, right? How do I identify if I am the defensive reactive player here or if I'm the aggressive player? I think for me, this is obvious in this particular matchup, but as a general rule, I think it's a good context to kind of have that conversation, right?
Yeah. So
Starts with the roll off.
yes, that the roll off is going to affect that to a large degree because going second in that aggro matchup is going to give you that advantage on grabbing the tempo and running away with it. The other thing we have to look at is how efficient are you at keeping that tempo? Do you have off turns? Can you just draw 4 cards that do nothing for you on keeping that tempo? Both those decks can have that, and that's where that role of who's on the beatdown can heavily switch up mid-match even. Sometimes it's because of hands that are drawn, sometimes because of the status of the game. So I would say generally that our former Lightning Briar, this is obviously post the bans to Briar, so I don't know that this is true anymore, but I think that the former Lightning Briar would have probably been the beatdown deck, and then the Lexi would have to find a control avenue to find ways to get damage through without really opening itself up too much to just being overrun by the Briar. That's my personal opinion. I'd like to hear, did you have a difference of opinion, Adam? Shay?
No, well, at least from who I would pick to be automatically the beatdown in that particular matchup, I thought it was a good example just because I think my first qualification for how I determine if I'm the aggressor or not is who I think has the better damage output. And when I say better, sometimes I do mean more consistent. My spikes can be higher out of Lexi. That's absolutely true. However, my consistency is nowhere near as good. Briar is going to put out 12, in its previous form, it was going to put out 12 plus damage every turn, consistently, all the time, drawing cards. Lexi's just not going to do that, right? And so that Lexi has to sit back, efficiency block, put arrows, stack its deck, stack its pitch. That's its game plan in that match. Whereas against somebody like a Dorinthia, it's the aggressor.
Correct.
It needs to keep the tempo. It has higher damage output. It might not be as efficient, but it can keep the control of the beatdown in that particular game. This is still relevant in control matches, right? So early Dash has no damage output. Early Oldhim, also a control deck, has a lot better damage output. They should be on the beatdown in that matchup, right? Because you need to whittle that Dash down before Dash reaches its inevitability. Same thing with like a Bravo Dash, things of that nature.
Well, and the similar thing can be talked about with like a aggro into a control fatigue matchup, right? So let's say you're Lightning Briar into control Dash, and let's say they're playing all their items. I don't necessarily know that I would say that's the right choice, but let's just pretend for a second that's happened. Say they're still at 30 life when they get their whole slew of items out. Suddenly you're not in a great spot anymore as the beatdown deck because they're going to be way more aggressive. They're going to be able to put out much bigger numbers consistently than you are. And if you can't make up that gap difference, suddenly you're on the back foot, right? And now your way of controlling them might just be more trying to do more aggression, but you got to pick your moments of can I afford to not take damage this turn? Can I afford to just not block? You may have built up and bought multiple embodiments in the past, and if that was the case and you had enough non-attacks, you just block on that turn, chip in for a little bit, come back harder the next turn, right? You'd have to look for those openings, and that's where we saw like the embodiments in Briar. That's what made it so strong before the errata, was because you could take that pivot and become the control deck really efficiently, and that's what made it really strong, right?
Yeah.
So. And that ability to flip the role easily was what made Briar.
I mean, I can even speak to in instances with like Aggro Katsu and Tadash players when they reach that inevitability point, and you've got them down around 10, and you're setting like nice up at like 30, and then it becomes a matter of like, I'm on a ticking clock now. I have to, if I'm going to like burn my entire hand into them being aggressive, then it needs to burn 2 to 3 cards out of their hand since their crackback isn't enough. Like it then becomes you're weighing, is my output better than what my defense would get me?
Exactly.
Because, yeah, it's, a little bit of arithmetic there. I will say, man, in an aggro matchup though, with how Briar used to be before Ball Lightning was banned, like I had one down to like 2-3 health, and I was like up at like 15, and it was just one turn of 3 Ball Lightnings into a Sting of Sorcery, 3 Ball Lightnings or whatever, and I was just like, well, there went all my health. I literally had no agency to do anything.
Sure,
So,
Right.
and that's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Those are gonna be games you're gonna have to pick up and walk away from.
Mhm.
Maybe you can think about, was I paying attention to how they were pitch stacking early? Maybe they did set that up, or maybe honestly they did get lucky. It happens, right? It's a card game. There is some variance all the time.
But pitch stacking brings up a very good point. Is in an aggro matchup, don't sometimes the aggro matchups you can draw out and it can take longer, and if you cycle through your deck and you pitched all your blues and the other aggro player was taking lower damage totals, but they were pitching a red here and there, and now we're coming into deck cycle 2 and their quality of attacks are relevant and yours are potatoes,
right.
That can be a thing.
And let's put that in context of what we're talking about here. So again, like, who is the beatdown in that scenario? That is somebody inappropriately recognizing when to not be the beatdown, right? They are over-aggressing early on, neutering themselves later, giving them no agency to switch from, am I the aggressor or not? There's no pivot turns. It allows somebody to appropriately identify, hey, I'm the defender here. I'm just happy to sit back and take this, because you're blowing through every heavy attack card you've got.
Yeah.
Right. And
I
mean, similar thing with in the control, right? If let's say you're Bravo or Noble Type Guardian, right, our usual competitors for controlling things, if you're versus a Dash, you need to recognize that his inevitability is her inevitability is better than yours. Similar thing versus maybe a Prism. You got to be able to recognize and adapt your game plan. When you see that they are going to be the one who wants to just sit back, maintain this kind of like status quo of like, you're just swinging your hammer. I'm okay with that. I'm just going to build a board state. That's what those two do as a game plan. And
situations you're forced to push.
Right. And so, but then similarly, oh, you're at 6 health, you might have 2 auras out, but if I can push aggressively enough on you, you're not going to do anything with those auras. Now you're changing from having to respect those auras to just, hey, I'm controlling what you're doing now, right? And making sure you're aware of those things. And I know it sounds like I'm saying like keep pushing the aggression, but recognizing when it's the correct time to push the aggression and when it's right time to respect what your opponent's doing. That's what we're really talking about here. Like, how are you correctly engaging how your opponent's doing things?
Yeah, when have you taken your last turn's worth of punch to the face before there are consequences to your action?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and another big thing that's, I think, kind of more important maybe that we see in Flesh and Blood than in Magic is how is your opponent responding to what you're doing as well, right? Because if let's say you're the one on the beatdown and your opponent was spending turn after turn after turn just blocking with their entire hand, and suddenly they say, I'll just take all that damage, you should know things are probably about to change, and if you can stop them from changing, you're probably being effective, right? Because they just took a bunch of damage to try and change the status quo. If you can prevent them from doing so, then you're probably in a good spot. So watching how your opponent's responding to you and then adapting your game plan to that, I think is also critically important.
Yeah, I think a lot of that to me comes down to observing hand efficiency. right? So that's watching blocking patterns, right? And I feel like efficiency in this game can be described in a lot of ways, right? It comes with how well do my cards block, how well do my cards attack, but it also comes with what is my resource curve? How many cards do I need to perform an effective attack? So, and how many cards do I lose? Not just how many do I need to perform. So Brute, for example, I've got a pitch, but I've also got a discard. That's fairly card inefficient, but it comes in heavily. It's not deck efficient. I don't have that long-term game viability. I need to be done later or earlier in the game. Then a Bravo, for example, who can potentially defend with 2 3-block cards every single time, blocking 6 plus damage, and then still swing for 6.
Without using a card.
Time. They're not losing cards, yes. Their card efficiency is high because those 2 cards are just going back into their deck. And so I think when I think of card efficiency, it is how well can I use my hand? So how much damage or how much defense can I pull out of 4 cards or out of 2 cards if that's what I'm given? How easy is it for me to put things back in my deck instead of into my discard pile or to my banished?
I mean, there's also setting up like the 5. Am I willing to sacrifice a lot this turn for 2 turns from now? I'll have my proper 5-card turn that will allow me to completely pivot the game. I mean, that's a thing. Like, if you're playing the punch them a lot aggro, that it's every time I don't defend, I play my 4 cards. You're going to probably lose more than you're going to win, because at some point you have to start stacking up that arsenal, sacrificing a little bit of 1 turn's efficiency for spike turns.
Completely agree. So I think we've talked about it a lot in this general phase, right? So we've established you build your deck for one way or the other, then you identify in the mid-match. We'll go ahead and say I think all 3 of us agree that if your deck is built to be aggressive, that does not mean that role never changes. It changes mid-game sometimes, depending on the situation, and it changes depending on your matchup. You can be the defender in a game.
If you have a crappy starting hand, turns out you're the defender, turn 1.
Absolutely. From a ton of different situations, right? Where do you end up in the roll-off, and how do your hands play out early? Or is the other deck more efficient at aggression than yours is, so you need to be more efficient at defense? I think the best way to talk about it now is to kind of go into that third layer, right? To talk about how you play and how you identify how to determine whether you're going to be the defensive or aggressive player in a mirror match. I'm going to give some background about what I mean about a mirror match, both for you guys and for everybody who's listening or watching. So there'd be direct mirrors, right? Drayton plays a deck. Adam also plays the same deck. We come up against each other, the exact same deck. That's, in my opinion, going to be much more difficult to identify because those are just really identifying pivot turns. It's not really identifying whether your deck is the beatdown or the defense in that. I think it comes down a lot more to luck. But that is my opinion, and I'll let you guys kind of argue that here in a minute.
So like in the case that you're talking about, I agree that identifying your pivot terms, there is some luck involved there. Now, what I will say is, like, the odds that you have a 100% 60 card mirror is very unlikely.
Extraordinarily low.
It's extraordinarily low. So, like, first, like, I'm gonna come back to that, but like, let's just say like you both plot down the same hero. Well, then you got to decide, okay, how do I make my sideboarding decisions to make what I want to do better, or am I changing completely what I'm doing because I think that switching roles is better for this matchup, right? So like this happened to me a ton during Roach Nationals when I was playing Katsu, right? Because every time I sat down across from Katsu, I didn't know if they were on the control or if they were on aggro. And at first, when I first was testing the deck, my initial thought process was like, okay, I'm gonna go to mid-range, because by going to mid-range, I'm going to make sure that if they are the more aggressive deck, then I can still be defensive. But if I am the more aggressive deck, I can still be more aggressive. And I realized very quickly that was the wrong choice. That was a huge mistake, because I was making whatever they wanted to do them better, and whatever I needed to do worse. So I later just started leaning hard into I'm gonna always just be the aggressor because I'm playing an aggro Katsu deck. So I'm gonna lean into I am the aggressor. I'm gonna try and be the beatdown deck as best I can. Does that mean I was always on the beatdown? No. but a lot of the times it led to me being able to dictate the pacing a lot more than whenever I was, hemming and hawing in mid-range, basically.
So
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so when it comes to mirror matches, just taking experience, from other games into Flesh and Blood, in L5R, mirror matches were a nightmare. And learning how to navigate your mirror match could be like a big thing. And that's kind of something I took to like Flesh and Blood as well. Having a sideboard is great and all. It actually makes mirrors where you can, once you've kind of drilled that mirror and you've figured out that cadence and pace of play, you can figure out in Katsu. If I'm doing the Katsu mirror, I'm going to go aggro regardless. I know what the control Katsu's game plan is. So I can know how to navigate around that if they show me that they are the control Katsu. Mid-range, I wouldn't care because, like Drayton said, it's a generalist. It's not doing either very well. I'll out-aggro it. It won't be able to out-control me. And in the aggro mirror, that is like, aggro. It's like playing against any other aggro deck. You're navigating it. You know what its lines of play are for the most part, as they're similar to yours. You're able to key in better in a aggro mirror match of, oh no, these are like key cards coming down. This is a turn I got to defend out. Because in Katsu in particular, they're trying to set up the, Whelming Gustwave line. Cool, I know I got to try to, depending on what Surging Strike comes down, I need to definitely make sure that the Whelming doesn't hit or whatever, so that they're not getting the extra resources when the Mugenshi comes out, or they're having to burn, the gauntlet so that, they have to pump up their thing. So you know how to like burn those resources. You know what's coming out for you in those that are like a profitable exchange. Because sometimes you get punched in the face, but oh cool, did they have to burn a piece of equipment and another like relevant one-time effect to pull that off? Well, cool. I know they don't have those options anymore. I do. Save up for my crackback kind of thing. Yeah. So it's navigating that mirrors is something I really like. If you're prepping for a tournament and you're concerned that like you're on a meta hero and you need to know how that mirror works, get a local to sleeve up the meta version of your deck and just drill that mirror like a dozen times. And when you do that, you're going to get this much more like nuanced understanding of the ebb and flow of at least what the meta idea of that deck is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's excellent advice for playing in the mirror, and is always going to come to a lot of fruition. I want to focus here a little bit on still identifying like what my role is going to be in that mirror and how I identify it, though, right? And so, since you both talked about Katsu, let's think about what small key card or resource differences would tell me that you're on a more aggressive version of Katsu than I am, right? So how do I identify as newbie today that you're on a mid-range Katsu deck instead of an aggro version? How do I identify that you're on a control Katsu deck instead of an aggro version? And I think there's a couple different mirror matches that really exemplify this, just that really need to see it. So Dash versus Dash, Viserai versus Viserai, Katsu and Katsu, Prism versus Prism, right? They're wide range heroes. They're harder to identify like what that role is. Do you guys think that's valuable or value added to say like in a Katsu matchup, here's what you would say, right? Like,
did they play a D-react?
Yeah, so as soon as you see a defense reaction, that's going to help you identify.
You have oversimplified it, but I approve.
And even before that, what chess piece are they running? Because a control Katsu is never, and I mean never, going to run. Oh, now my brain is just turned off. We were Hardened Crosstrap. They're never going to run Hardened Crosstrap. They're going to run Tunic. Because it's more resources for a longer game plan, and it blocks. In a pinch,
they will occasionally roll the Breeze Rider boots as well.
They will also roll Breeze Rider boots a lot of the time because again it blocks. And so looking at their equipment can be a big sign of like are they aggro or are they control. Now mid range you're going to see different things. And just because they have a Tunic does not mean they are not an aggro deck. A lot of aggro Katsus run Tunic over Hardened Crosstrap. It just kind of depends.
I think it's actually a safe call in the mirror, just because if your opponent is on the control Katsu,
it's going to be a longer game.
Yeah.
And it lets you get spikier turns with things like Art of War, because Art of War really flourishes off of that card. But like realistically, like I agree to some degree with what Shay was saying of like seeing if you can cheat out some of their equipment, and this is where arguments can be made for having things like the defense reactions and whatnot. But really, what you're wanting to find as the Katsu player in that mirror is you're wanting to find an opening where they have to respect you because it's one of your big turns attacks, but you have the tools to say, I got you. So whether that's you popping your Snapdragon Sailors, whether that's popping your gloves, whether that's you playing that Ancestral Empowerment you've been tucked in Arsenal for 2 turns, you gotta get that gotcha moment. So that way you can just like wrestle the tempo from them and put them in a place where they can't really afford to take the off turn to re-grab the tempo. What that's going to look like over the course of the game, whether it's being pressuring damage through or kind of sitting back and playing the more defensive role, it's going to depend on some of the early card draws and things of that nature. But you're not just looking for a Whelming Gustline line. You're looking for a Whelming Gustline line that where you're also going to get a push over. And the other thing is like being able to sniff that out as the opponent is kind of what you're hoping you're able to do as well, because again, it's an attack reaction type plan, and hoping that you don't have to commit too many times to that.
The other big thing in the Katsu mirror in particular is who has to break their mask first.
Correct.
That's
the huge advantage.
Huge. But I think we talked a lot about Katsu, so I want to move on to some of these other matchups. Like for instance, I think Dash and Prism are super relevant. I do want to briefly talk about Viserai versus Viserai. I think it's becoming more relevant as he's coming back into kind of the metasphere. I've talked to some people online, and the current online opinion from what I've been hearing seems to be that like you play OTK into each other, and I don't necessarily disagree that like that isn't availability of like if you see, hey, I can build up a bunch of rune chants really fast and I can get to like 18, 20, do a big OTK turn. Absolutely, you should probably do something like that. But just both of you sitting there going, oh, I'm just going to draw my OTK cards and do the big swing. If you're both doing that, you're leaving a lot up to variance. And so, for instance, if you just go, okay, I'm at 10 rune chants, I drop, and all I have are attack actions. And if I say pass, my opponent might not have drawn all attack action cards. And so they might say, cool, I'm going to make more rune chants. And now they're, actually kind of in a way on the beatdown because they're making the rune chants. I'm stuck with all these attack actions in hand, and I can't do anything with them. So you have to really assess what your game plan is letting you do. That's not, again, it's not to say that a big OTK swing is not going to, a big OTK swing is going to close out any game in Flesh and Blood for Viserai. But you have to really think about what your hand is letting you do and whether or not that's a good idea to push into that. Similar thing of what does your opponent have? How much life do they have currently when they're pushing into the OTK? So you really gotta respect and watch what your opponent's doing in Flesh and Blood. You can't just like have a game plan, stick to it, and hope that it works out.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I like that the Viserai. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm fine with it. I was going to say, even if you know your opponent's on OTK, you at least have to adjust the way you're going to be doing OTK. Or you're basically, again, just rolling the dice on who's going to get it faster. Because nobody is going to mess up their OTK plan when you're not affecting it at all.
Right.
I'm not attacking you. I'm not trying to disrupt you. I'm not allowing you to get these other cards out of your hand. It's just literal rune chant generation. There's too much luck in that if you're not going to make any adjustments whatsoever.
Correct.
So don't let your Viserai mirrors just become like a Dragon Ball Z fight where you're both just setting and like screaming at each other and powering up. It's an important thing.
Yeah, I think that's a relatively decent way of summarizing it.
Yeah.
My childhood flashed in front of my eyes. You had gold hair temporarily.
Let's jump to Dash v Dash.
Okay.
So I think that again, like let's assume for a second that like the items are the big thing that we're going to want to look at here most of the time. They might be a boost dash, they might not. Like if it's a boost dash, you're probably going to take this more of like what we were talking about with the aggro decks. But let's say we're leaning more into the item stuff of the things. It's going to be who hits those early items. And if you see that, oh hey, my opponent has already played out two items and I haven't played out any yet other than my starting one, guess what? You're on the beatdown. You need to be pressuring them hard. Your game plan of pitch some blues and do some things is not effective. You need to be playing your more aggressive red attacks. You need to be boosting even if it's risky, and you need to be going for that pressure because honestly, if you're not, they're going to probably build up their item spread faster than you are at that point, and even if they're not building up faster, they're going to be more aggressive with their items at that point because they have 3 items and you have 1. So that's my thought process as you're watching the pace at which the items are coming out. But any things to add to that, boys?
I think it really comes down to as much chip damage as you get in. Because, I mean, sure, to a degree, it's did I draw my items, variants, blah, 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 you're getting things dropped down. But, typically you're probably going to be able to get like a random pistol shot in here and there. And here's the thing. Every card you could burn from their hand is slowing them down. So even if you're like getting your items out more, even if you're behind, it's coming down to like those things. If you guys are tied and it's not clear cut, there's still something to be said if you're putting this kind of soft pressure of like, all right, you have to respect me with something from hand, or you're going to take like 2 pot shot damage or something. As long as it's not coming at the like cost of you getting out your key things, I think there's something to that. But then I'm not a dash player because the dash mirror sounds miserable.
That's the thing is that's what I'm saying is like if you are the person who is not, if let's say it's a control versus control mirror, right? Because that's for items that matter the most. A lot of times you might have like a handful of blues. Doesn't matter if you're the person who's behind on getting the items out. You still have to push for that chip damage because, like you're saying, otherwise they're just going to be able to inevitability you too easily. You have to push for trying to get those cards out of hand.
Yeah.
I'm saying even if you're the person ahead, you should be putting through some chip damage because then you're widening the gap.
They will be like.
Yeah. They will. Yeah. The only thing I'll add to the mechanologist discussion, I feel like, especially say you are looking for a control versus control, or even maybe you think you're aggro versus aggro, I think I'm looking for key cards that might say that I need to be more aggressive because they have better inevitability. So for example, if my opponent has slotted in more than the normal overloops, so more than just the blue overloop, they have the red and the yellow, I would say they have better inevitability than I do. Those are going to be things that I'm required to block out, which means they gain a card deck advantage on me, or they'll gain a deck advantage on me if I don't block them out because they get that card back into their deck. So that's important to me. If I am an aggressor deck, I am paying attention to their boost cards like High Octane. I might even be paying attention to how many High Octanes I see, even if they get pitched and not played. Because High Octane's a game changer in that particular deck and can really shift the deck into a heavily aggressive deck from a control deck, or at least push a control deck into a solid mid-range. If that's the case, you might be looking for a cheeky maximum velocity. I know a lot of decks at least run that in their sideboard. That's primarily for Prism and they never play it, but it could affect the mirror pretty drastically.
Yeah, I think another card that is less thought of in the aggro situation is actually Teklo Core. 2 free resources for 2 turns. Like knowing that they're on for those 2 turns, you're probably going to be more on the control fatigue side in those turns, just because they're going to have extra resources.
Especially if they choose to start with it.
Moving over to Prism v Prism, which is I think one that we all have the least experience with.
Actually, that's the one outside of Katsu I have the most experience with, sir.
Okay. So in my experience with it, it seems that it really comes down to who can hit their auras and get aura establishment up faster. That's pretty much it. It's kind of similar to the dash, where you're really looking for those key cards that let you do your game plan. Now, if you're Herald Prism, then things change drastically, but I don't think we need to talk too much about that because it's not really as relevant of a deck these days.
It's for sure the less efficient one. I mean, if you slot in some Spears of Serality, it gives you a fair amount of aggression in the mirror. So that would potentially give you an advantage, enable you to be on the beatdown even against another control. But how many people have that much sideboard for it?
Well, and control prisms are usually running 6 or more, 7+ attacks, so I
So
think
they're
it's 6 to
prepared for you
9. So
regardless, right?
yeah, so you're in the mirror, you're probably not cracking through, at least in my
I think
opinion.
Then what you're just looking for things like Ode to Wrath, making them slightly better at the control situation, them getting that kind of thing out early. Everybody's going to be running Merciful, Retribution.
Like I
Nobody's
said,
gonna
it
run
really comes
Herald
down
in
more
that.
to the auras in that instance, right? So
Yeah, maybe your Heralds of Rebirth if you're just really looking for efficiency there, paying attention to that and protection.
Yeah, it's just if you can get like a cheeky Herald through or something, it's big. That's kind of your pivot turn.
worth noting though, Phantasmal Footsteps says 6 strength non-phantasmal attacks, so you can block off your footsteps all game long.
Yep, you do typically get a lot of advantage of that. I actually think Herald of Ravages is very good in the mirror just because the arcane ping damage. I don't have a ton extra to say about the Illusionist mirror though. What do you guys think? Anything else wrapping our beatdown discussion?
No, I
No.
think like the big key thing that like for those of you who are coming over to Flesh and Blood from Magic is to remember that like every card in your hand has multiple uses, and that you need to be thinking about that for yourself, but also you need to be thinking about like what your opponent is using their cards for as well, and that's going to help you establish what your role in that game is. How are you using your cards versus how's your opponent using their cards, and when and if does that need to change, right? So if you see some unusual behavior from what your opponent's doing, probably indicates that they are trying to change the status quo, right? So for instance, I've been playing versus Bravo, who's been trying to block a bunch and only like swing with their hammer, and suddenly they're keeping back an extra card that's sitting in their hand, and they have 2 resources floating. I smell a pummel coming. That hammer's hitting for 10. It's that type of stuff, right? So
It's very rare to play a solitaire deck in Flesh and Blood that I do not care what you do and that I should not be paying attention to your pitch, your hand, etc. all the time.
Unless you're Kano and Blitz, then you get to sometimes play the good old solitaire.
You did indeed identify the only deck that I feel like you just virtually don't care what your opponent does.
Oh man, it's just like gambling, man. You're just
It's-
like, oh, it's on the top. Is it? Oh.
It's really more ask how many cards they have in hand at the end of their turn, and that's primarily all you care about. But yeah. Okay, guys. Well, I think that's gonna dust us off for this particular topic. So I'm gonna carry us off. Say thanks for listening for everybody who is listening. I'm also gonna say thanks for watching because in theory, some of you can actually now be staring at our faces on YouTube. We apologize for our backgrounds. This will improve in the future. Bear with us as we improve. But it's been a fun process, and we hope to continue to make things better for you as we go forward. If you want to keep up with us, you can find us on Facebook at Kodachi43. We'll give some more giveaways and things like that in the future, and that's the easiest way to be eligible for those, as it's very hard to track our podcast subscribers. As always, this podcast is sponsored by Edmund Unplugged and Oklahoma, and it's the home store of our hosts. So thanks for listening. Enjoy playing in the Flesh and Blood.
Witty outro thing.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the Flesh and Blood community. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, please share us, leave us a like or a review. If you want to engage with us directly, please find us on Facebook at Kodachi43. And remember, we're available for download on all major podcast providers. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you again in 2 weeks. Until then, enjoy playing Flesh and Blood.